But now we move on to our main story of the day, which is, of course, the efforts on improving the startup ecosystem as well as improving the entrepreneurial ecosystem. The effort of developing startup companies is increasingly fast, and in this region, of course, the largest measure of what we want for them is to achieve a unicorn level when they reach the value of $1 billion. But to compare with Malaysia, other countries in the same region has better numbers in producing unicorn companies, and therefore we need to understand the factors that affect this position and what we can do to better that situation and improve on governmental policies post GE15. So joining me live online is the co-founder and evangelist of Proficeo, Dr Sivapalan Vivekarajah. Dr Siva, how are you this morning? We need to understand about the issues of policies that are needed by the new government to ensure a vibrant growth of the startup ecosystem as well as to support entrepreneurs, not necessarily in the startup area, but of course in the SME areas as well.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for having me. I'm really feeling very good today. And it's, of course, it's an important day because of the meeting of the Election Commission, yeah? So in terms of policies, I would like to talk about three separate areas, and you probably hear about this very often. First one is talent, second one is market access, and the third one is funding. But I have a slightly different take on this. So in terms of talent, and really the thing that will make us most successful, even more than money, is actually talent. So I'm going to talk about two aspects, long-term and short-term. So the one thing that we need to do better in terms of long-term policy is at school and university level, we need to focus more on STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and maths. We need to focus more, we need to foster a love for STEM so that we get more computer science and engineering graduates. I mean, for AI, the future, right? Future technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analytics, we need more maths grads, for example. So we need to also train better STEM teachers and pay them more and even incentivize them when their students do well. If we cannot create a large enough number of talent in STEM, we will have a difficult time in the future building a startup ecosystem.
Now, Silva, are you saying that we need to have policies better in STEM moving forward for the new government, focus on STEM? Is that what you're trying to say?
That's right. So because the future of the world is dependent on technology, and technology is dependent on STEM. So we really need to do that, right? But the short-term policy, because that's a long-term policy, the short-term policy is startups need talent today. They need them now. So the immigration department needs to be a lot more open. We need a more open door policy for immigration, where we should be able to get the talent that the startups want, and they need to be able to process their visas fast, make it simple, shouldn't have cumbersome processes, for example.
Okay,
right?
It sounds like that
If we can
challenge is
attract
actually
more
quite
talent,
universal, Dr. Siva, because when you have better improvements in terms of immigration policies, you need to arrange that kind of understanding with other ASEAN countries. Do you feel that that could be the bigger challenge moving forward in terms of trying to get better mobility amongst ASEAN countries, including that of Malaysia?
I think if we have a more open door policy in terms of attracting talent, we're not only dependent on ASEAN. We have a lot of talent that can come in from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan, from Kyrgyzstan, from even Bangladesh and Pakistan. There's actually a lot of good talent there.
I don't know.
So
my point is this.
Policy,
better mobility amongst ASEAN countries is dependent among each other. It's easy for us to argue that we need to have better talent to come in, but it's actually quite hard for us to pull off because we need the consensus of ASEAN member countries, not necessarily talents from ASEAN, but trying to get better mobility amongst ASEAN countries. We can get talents from Kazakhstan, but it's very hard to get the way that you propose to get greater mobility for talents internationally.
I think there's actually a lot of talent, for one example, yeah. There's actually a lot of talent in our local private universities, for example. So Malaysia is actually a large, it is very successful with private universities, and we actually attracting a lot of students from the region as well as outside the region from Asia. And if you think about it, all of these students come to Malaysia, they live in Malaysia for a few years, they study, they do well, and then we let them all go back. Now, if we have a policy where students that do well, second class, upper, first class students, if we give them a visa to stay on in Malaysia and work in Malaysia, we don't even have to worry about whatever mobility issues that we have within ASEAN.
All right, Dr.
These students
Siva,
are
we have
already
about
here.
2 or 3 minutes left. Can you share with us
Yeah.
what policy has worked previously and what didn't work and must be changed in light of the new government that might be voted in just a few weeks from now?
Okay, I think what we need is we need to have long-term policies that really work. So if I give an example of Cradle Fund, for example, for the last 15 years, the government has been funding Cradle Fund annually. They give them an annual budget to give out grants to startups. And for the last 15 years, Cradle has been doing this very successfully. They have funded about 1,000 companies, and we have created many great startups, from Grab to Easy Parcel to Signature Market and so on. So what we need is a consistent long-term policy. The same for funding, even with like Penjana Capital. If they give them 600 million a year, long-term, this will actually flow down and create more consistency, and we can create more successful policies.
Dr. Siva,
I
to
think
recap, the
one
long-term
thing
policy that
is
you
short-term
recommend,
policy.
Dr. Siva,
Yes.
just to recap, the long-term policy that you recommended, one is, of course, improving STEM. Second is, of course, improving mobility. And perhaps, would you like to add number 3 or number 4 that we need to share with the government or incoming government on what would work in the future?
Okay, so I would say the third one would be we need more funding in the ecosystem. There just isn't enough. And although we have funding, it's not consistent. 2 years ago, we had a budget for 600 million for Penjana. Now we don't have anything. I think what we need to do is if the government says every year I will give 600 million for venture capital funding via Penjana, we will create a lot more startups, a lot more successful startups.
Before we end,
the
Dr.
last
Siva,
policy is...
Sorry, go on,
Sorry.
the last item.
The last policy is market access. I think we need to create more of a Buy Malaysia policy, especially for GLCs, PLCs, and the government. Because if we have a more stronger Buy Malaysia policy, our startups can sell more locally and they can create more jobs locally. We need to do that.
Before we end, Dr. Siva, maybe you can share with us 1 or 2 things that you really think has not worked and must end very immediately.
I think the biggest issue really is not about policies. We have very good policies. I must say that the government has done well. I think the thing that hasn't worked is that implementation of the policies haven't been very good. So for example, over the last few years, there's always a lot of loans and grants that are given out to SMEs, but it never trickles down because the process is cumbersome, it takes too long, the agencies maybe don't understand how to do this. So the implementation part is where we have actually not done well enough. If we can do that better, the policies will work better. And I think that's one of the things that we need to correct going forward.
Do you feel that including the private sector in terms of implementation and execution could actually address this shortcoming?
I absolutely think so. I think, it should be, for example, when you talk about loans, you should get the private sector to also provide this, but give them the right kind of mandates. If you're going to look at the grants, people like Cradle Fund and MDEC can work with the private sector. For example, do matching funds with angel investors, for example. So if angel investors put in some money, the government can put in some money. We do this with the equity crowdfunding with the MySIF fund. Every time angels invest in equity crowdfunding, MySIF fund does a matching grant. So if we bring in the private sector, I think it will work a lot better, actually.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Sivapalan Vivekarajah, better known as Dr. Siva, the Chief Evangelist at Proficeo. He's, of course, also a general partner at a Malaysian accelerator company called Scale Up Malaysia.